The question therefore becomes, is the BND hiding behind its sacred date palm tree? And is it doing a good job? That the architectural detailing of phoenix symbolism, oracles and portals to other realms, is a powerful ideological weapon in its own right, coheres with the idea that the architecture of power serves to intervene within public consciousness. As the filmmaker Jonathan Meades put it in his work on the totalitarian architecture of Joseph Stalin, the despot's ideal is a building which imprisons the mind within the body. Only here, the architecture of classicism imprisons the mind in the exaggerated sense of freedom inherent to all liberal democracies. The Corinthian column's main role could therefore be said to involve both protection as a shield and deception, where this protective shield communicates different truths to different viewers or readers. For example, the often oblique or hidden phoenix worm is interchangeable with the funerary palmette, the last remaining trace of the actual leaves of the sacred palm tree. The inner journey of the priest or priestess is, I argue, here externalized to the public realm. Whatever is hidden within this architecture, it is certainly tied up with a type of gateway, and the iconography of plants, trees, or other botanical forms seems to take the space of the quote sorcerer unquote, highlighted by Dr. Voth when he discusses the mind of the prehistorical shaman who depicted pre-animal forms in the early era of cave painting. Only now have we, the ordinary public, become prey to the predatory white patriarchal supremacism invested in such buildings as supreme courts, grand churches and cathedrals, banks, stock exchanges and the like. Simply look at them. Artists and cultural institutions display specific sensitivity to the expression of these ideas by making exact replicas of the original Corinthian column at the Temple of Apollo. The Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, featured above, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art adhere almost verbatim to the Corinthian design at Delphi. It is worth noting, again, that from the whole three-tiered system of the Corinthian order, the one which expressly demonstrates leaves, brackets, though of course date palms are implicit in the Ionic order, close brackets, is the Corinthian, at the top of this hierarchy. They are at the summit of all classical and neoclassical architectural designs, secondary in hierarchical order only to the gods themselves, which are depicted in the pediment. One of the key aspects which classical architectural hierarchies, such as the Corinthian order, obscure, is that biology doesn't get stuck the way humans do. It does have hierarchies, but they are contingent and contextual. Each part of the food web is symbiotically connected as much as it is enmeshed in cycles of consumption and being consumed. The final futility of using architecture to reinforce patriarchal power structures in the face of human mortality forces esoteric practices and, quote, the mysteries, unquote, into the position of the taboo. Those ideas or practices which are taboo must be maintained as such in order for societies to be able to admit their existence, brackets, even to themselves, close brackets. Typically, a taboo involves the transgression of a society or a culture's formal values, but which nonetheless forms an integral aspect of its existence, such as the drug and arms trades. In this sense, it is probably safe to say that such practices or beliefs constitute a form of deviant knowledge, a truth or series of truths that a society has not yet been able to fully domesticate, or cannot afford, or brackets is unable, close brackets, to eradicate. The taboo of polytheism that pagan symbolism has brought with it into the Judeo-Christian and modern worlds, for instance in the form of the green man, which many scholars argue represents the Egyptian Osiris, must therefore also be protected. Here, that which is morally problematic becomes also sacred and is concurrently protected and vilified as taboo, despite standing in plain sight. The trick, as it were, is to contextualize the use of the sacred palm tree in the environment of the time in which its meaning is sought, now or in the distant past. The illustration on page 114 is a photograph I took of the Philadelphia Museum of Art that was erected in 1928, and as described, the column is verbatim with that found at the original Temple of Apollo 2,500 or so years prior. It's very ornate, and what I really like about the columns, I never thought I'd really find myself saying like about these columns, but yeah, I guess now I do like them. I've been sort of sucked in and hypnotized. But once you see them with color on them, they really come to life and they're much more interesting. And I think it was in chapter 1 that we talked about the fact that Goethe presumed them to be, symbols of purity and purity of thought because they were without color. But then actually the archaeologists discovered that they'd all been painted and that they just lost their color over time. These have been painted. The image shows it in sunlight and sort of shadow to the right, and you start to get some of the kind of full complexity of the museum's facade in the image with a blue sky. Where I have found patterns between the formal representation, abstraction and mass replication of the sacred palm tree motif from the Fertile Crescent to the 10th millennium, through the classical Corinthian order of architecture to the Bundesnachrichtendienst building of the German Secret Service, built in 2016, the familiarity of this design ties the cultural evolution of the motif of the sacred palm tree to my model of cultural epigenetics. Zooming in on the use of the sacred palm tree, to the extent that material evidence is forthcoming, reveals such a polyphony of expressions as to evoke the idea of biological background mutation. As time progresses, the number of different articulations on the theme has of course only increased. But the number lost, deleted expressions of the motif is far greater, due to entropic decay and historical erasure. Zooming in further to, quote, moments, unquote, of visible cultural evolution, such as the abstraction of the sacred palm tree motif, renders the kind of change being witnessed, I argue, as an example of cultural mutation. For example, in the shift into the Doric, Ionic and Corinthian stages of the Greek Corinthian order. As the architectural simulacra of the sacred palm tree demonstrates, the identification of previous mutations which break with the replicating logic of a given form can be lost to linear time. I argue that this has permitted power to claim authority, if not outright authorship, of given sacred symbols. For when Vitruvius states that the Corinthian column originates with the Greek sculptor Callimachus, scholars know he is lying, but few take the time to prove it. Another aspect of the repeated use of this form is that it banalizes its religious esoteric roots. I have seen so many Corinthian columns in my life that were it not for my peevish obsession with them, I would never have known of their connections as gateways to other realms of reality. The question is not whether this or that symbol means the same thing in this or that context. The question is how and why that symbol has retained its replicating abilities. While power is neither the riddle nor the answer to that question, it is inherently part of the problem of knowing and the epistemologies or the roots of knowing in the first place. As the cultural theorist and activist Stuart Hall once said, history does not occur as a conspiracy theory, so there must be a process of quote-unquote natural selection at play within the cultural brackets as well as biological evolution. Quote, "The connection between the secret police and secret societies is obvious. The establishment of the former needed and used the arguments and dangers arising from the existence of the latter." Unquote. Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951. It seems likely to me that the people who work at the BND have a working knowledge of the history of the Fertile Crescent, the modern-day Middle East, especially given the proliferation of German arms sales to countries in the region. The illustration on page 116 is a sort of abstract depiction of the way in which cultural epigenetics could look. I guess it's sort of almost like a painting version. It comes from the original genetic diagrams earlier in the book. And then what Jorn and I have done is kind of show cyclical patterns of epigenetic activation. So lots of kind of like histones layered up in rows of 4 with adjoining loops of genetic material underneath. And it's very sort of figurative and I have to say rather elegant. Okay. Do they view their own metallic palm trees on a continuum with the sacred palm trees of old? Again, the clue is probably in the name of the institution itself, which literally works in the service of secrets. Or are these columns a reference to the mobile supercomputer cell towers that have been built to mimic palm trees in Egypt and across the world? We cannot know. But I doubt that the motif simply popped into an architect's head and travelled, as if by magic, one could say, through the multiple rounds of selection and adaptation into development and realization on the butt of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, Berlin, Germany. Historic mutations or epigenetic reinterpretations. Patterns are one way of visualizing epigenetic process. Unlike successful mutations which occur over many, many lifetimes, epigenetic change occurs much more frequently. Particular aspects of particular processes of epigenetic change, with visible outcomes, such as weight loss or gain, are easier to study than microscopic short-term cellular mutations. This is because epigenetic changes occur within a faster cycle, though the process is still highly complex. In the case of large complex organisms such as humans, epigenetic developmental changes happen within our lifetimes, while full mutations take thousands of years to become phenotypically visibly apparent. To find the most explicit patterns of epigenetic behaviour, I am going to continue to use the case of epigenetic silencing in plants. A good example of a repeated pattern of epigenetic activity is the famous seasonally flowering thailcress cited earlier in Chapter 1. Thailcress has a relatively simple genetic sequence, brackets, its genome, close brackets. And as such, it was the first organism to have its genome mapped. If I imagine a string of beads, with one differently coloured bead raised to a higher position than the others, this pattern could be accurately repeated for every seasonal cycle of the plant's life. These patterns are studied in the field of microbiology. For a larger organism, such as a human being, the activity of the epigenome is less regular. It fluctuates across one's lifespan, depending on stress, diet, and other environmental factors. Epigenetic tagging is often described as hereditary, meaning that the performativity of the epigenome is held in a repetitive pattern until this process of replication is disrupted. However, the implication of such claims, while tempting for ethical arguments concerning social justice, is problematic. Both genetic inheritance and the science of epigenetics are often more complex than most interdisciplinary practitioners are able to fully grasp, leading to greedy reductionism. Quote, "Inheritance is not necessary for epigenetic mechanisms to operate. Rather, they interact with environmental exposures throughout the life course and can even change stochastically without necessitating inheritance from previous generations." Unquote. Jonathan Y. Huang, Epigenetics changes nothing. What a new scientific field does and does not mean for ethics and social justice. April 11, 2018. The study of causation between our environment and the legible genes we pass on to the next generation through epigenetic tags is still very young. It's easier to map in plants, while patterns found in the study of larger organisms are often inconclusive. Nonetheless, abusive relationships during childhood have been shown to affect a person's cell behaviour with consequences in later life, and it is epigenetic silencing or activation that carries that abuse into the body's cells. One example of this correlation has been found between early humanoid development and adult life, notably between instances of childhood abuse and suicide. Footnote 14. Ibid M. Dick, quote, "Access to human brain tissue is limited to post-mortem studies of donated brains, which are generally unique and unrepresentative samples. Nonetheless, a recent study of human brain samples from the Quebec Suicide Brain Bank found evidence of increased DNA methylation of the axon 1F promoter in hippocampal samples from suicide victims compared with controls, but only if suicide was accompanied with a history of childhood maltreatment." Unquote. A clear example of the hereditary function of the epigenome in animals can be found in the famous study of interactions between rat mothers and their offspring. Here, there are clear, self-replicating patterns between the nurturing behaviour of the mother rat and the nurturing habits of the next generation. Other examples of how epigenetic silencing or activation operate have involved the development of differing epigenomes in genetically identical twins. Because of the gene's plasticity, twins who have had different class experiences, which confer a better diet, less stressful working conditions, and a less polluted living environment, to the more affluent twin, would develop completely different genes over time. What does this all mean? The belief that the human mind communicates with, and in so doing alters the state of material objects, was once described by anthropological practitioners of the so-called global north as animism. Today, the study of epigenetics demonstrates that the human will does alter the material body, if only by the simple act of prioritizing healthy eating and regular exercise. Were it as simple as that, then everyone should just acquire the better diet, less stressful working conditions and less polluted living environments of the affluent in order to pass on healthy genes to the next generation. Easy. Were it that simple, on an evolutionary continuum from A to B, epigenetics could be described in terms of patterns, and mutations could be understood as deviancy. But evolutionary continuums are still stuck in the concept of linear time. And because linear time implicitly proposes the idea of progress, making the argument that all we need to do is fix our genes is an argument for eugenics. Practice on humans, that would bring us full circle back to the worst colonial and genocidal atrocities of the recent past. I could even argue that the very concept of linear time allows power to carry out its habit of erasure. And this erasure, on a cultural level, which I am calling cultural epigenetics, negates, prevents, critique. An example of the sacred palm tree becoming epigenetically silenced over time, a process which activates new cultural canons such as classical architecture, is also a process through which people of colour and black people have been abused over time. In this sense, the transition of the sacred palm tree into the Corinthian order demonstrates the coextension of politics and culture. How the hell do you think that knowledge became esotericized into the white canon in the first place? Through symbolic and physical violence, dummy. Cultural epigenetics does not negate linear time. It is linear time, as it is expressed through cultural hegemonies and the status quo. There are infinite other examples, but the sacred palm tree is a good start. That culture is a form of oppressive violence should be apparent from the 485 monuments and memorials removed during the worldwide protests for Black Lives Matter in the wake of the public execution of George Floyd by United States police in May 2020. And I would read those brave actions as a reflex of a society seeking to reshape the manner of its own cultural replication for future generations. The action of societies intervening with all their revolutionary potential into their own cultural epigenome. Over time, what may appear to constitute a clear cultural pattern may also have been a series of highly dynamic deviations when they occurred. Only time can tell. Between centuries, perhaps only years, the motif of the sacred palm tree can be seen to have taken on a variety of differentiated forms. From the perspective of a person observing the frequency of palm tree motifs within sacred architecture, thousands of years later, the morphology of the symbol demonstrates a clear pattern, brackets, albeit with variation. As conspiracy theorists have passionately attempted and failed to resolve, a semblance of reality is more misleading than an acknowledgement of the complexity of our world and universe, which is another way of saying that just because white people couldn't do it, doesn't mean it was aliens. Finally, there is another, fairly straightforward answer to the proliferation of the sacred palm tree, inspired by the historical work The Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture and the San Domingo Revolution, 1938, by legendary Trinidadian historian C.L.R. James. In his description of 18th century slave plantations on the mountainous island of San Domingo, brackets modern-day Haiti, C.L.R. James mentions the palm by name. On page 28, quote, "Field upon field, the light green sugar cane, low and continuously rippled in the breeze, enclosed the factory and the dwelling houses like a sea. A few feet above the cane stalks waved the 5-foot leaves of the banana trees. Near the dwelling houses, the branches of the palm, crowning a perfectly rounded and leafless column of 60 or 70 feet, gave forth, like huge feathers, a continuously soothing murmur." Unquote. A few pages thereafter, on page 31 to 32, he goes on to describe town life and the presence, of course, of a Masonic lodge. Quote, "The towns of San Domingo, at the height of its prosperity, were little more than villages. In Port-au-Prince, the official capital of the colony, the population washed their dirty linen, made indigo and soaked manioc in the water of the only spring which supplied the town. Despite repeated prohibitions, they continued to beat their brackets enslaved persons in the streets. Such culture as there was centered in these towns. In Le Cap there were various Masonic and other societies, the most famous of which was the Philadelphia Circle, a body devoting itself to politics, philosophy, and literature. But the chief reading of the population consisted of lascivious novels." Unquote. The answer to the proliferation of the sacred palm, central to classical and neoclassical culture, and therefore also the Masons, as I have demonstrated at length, is that those who thought they were promoting the ancient Greek values of democracy and the French virtues of liberty and brotherhood simply had no idea where the architectural forms they cherished came from. Everyone walks blindly into the future, but some of us are truly blind to the past.